All right, hello and welcome back to the Generative Landscape discussion series. I'm joined today by Hamel Husain, who is a machine learning engineer and data scientist. Very excited to talk to him about his recent work on things like developer tooling, but also he's just informed me before we started recording that he plans to also turn the questioning around, ask me some questions, so we should have a pretty good discussion. Hamel, thank you so much for joining us.
Yeah, I'm really excited to be here. Um, yeah, so should we just jump right into it, or
Yeah, well, maybe do you want to give us a little bit of an intro on yourself, how you got into this world of data science and machine learning, just so that people have a bit of backstory for your journey into this realm?
yeah. So yeah, I started out with data science, machine learning, kind of after college. Um, as far back as 2003 or so. So that dates me. I'm kind of old. I was building credit risk models for banks. Back then, there was no deep learning and there was no Python or you know nothing like that. I think I was using SPSS, some statistical software. It was all very rudimentary at the time. I did that for a year. Then I went into management consulting for a bit, doing a lot of data analytics type of work. So a lot of reports and SQL and Excel and you know all that stuff. After a while, I thought machine learning might be interesting, but I had a midlife crisis and went to law school at some point. Decided I hated that, and then after I got done with that, I went back to consulting for a little bit just to get off of law, and then I went to go work at a startup called Data Robot. I did a robot at that time. I believe it was 2014 or so. It had a lot of Kaggle people, grandmasters and things like that. So I figured, okay, I'm gonna go there and sit next to all of these Kaggle people and learn what they know. And it was an amazing experience. I learned a lot of things there. It was like jumping into the fire of machine learning at that time. And it was also jumping into the fire of building tooling, which was great. And I kind of caught the bug of building data science tooling sort of from there. So I really recognized the power of building tools for people. After that, I got I thought Airbnb might be an interesting place to work, or really working in Silicon Valley. So I tried really hard to find something there, and I found Airbnb. I worked there for a bit. Then eventually, I switched to GitHub when I had to work remotely. I moved to Portland for family reasons, and so I wanted more of a remote job, and went to GitHub for that. That's where I met Jeremy. I started contributing to FastAI. I was already doing lots of machine learning work at the time when I was at Airbnb. This was in 2016 or 2017, and that's around the time deep learning became really popular. And it was really hard to learn deep learning back then. And Jeremy came out with this course. At the time, it was in TensorFlow, Keras. And it was like the only way to learn that stuff at that time. So I got really fascinated with that. And then eventually, I started contributing to FastAI stuff. That carried over into GitHub. At GitHub, I did a lot of open source contributions there. I set up a lot of the DevOps stuff for FastAI, like the CI, GitHub Actions, Docker containers and testing. That sounds boring, but it actually required me to go pretty deep into a lot of software related FastAI things. And somewhere along the way, I got really involved in MBDev, which is this notebook software development for notebooks, which really fascinated me. And then eventually, after working so long with FastAI, I decided, just to make it official and just join Fast AI full time and try to figure out how to commercialize it and how to live sustainably while working at, while doing something that is Fast AI. Because as the story goes, when I was at GitHub, I would always find excuses to do work with Jeremy, some kind of like joint project. And it was really easy at GitHub because everything kind of superficially uses GitHub. So you can sort of make a story of why this is GitHub relevant. And then I actually had a brief stint at a startup that kind of after GitHub and before Fast AI called Outer Bounds, which is folks that are building Metaflow. And yeah, I was there for a little bit. I really like Metaflow, and I like ML tooling. That's why I went there. But then this opportunity came up to work with Jeremy in Fast AI, so I didn't want to miss out on that, and kind of jumped at the opportunity.
Right.
But anyways, that's kind of my life story.
That's a really good life story, and all of that is why I'm really excited to have you on, because I think, for a lot of us who are fairly new into the space, or we've seen like one dynamic, right? I've come in, I've learned this kind of deep learning, and I do it in this way. You have this long history of seeing data science versus machine learning, old school, predictive modeling versus deep learning at startups, at big companies, at GitHub, working with open source, and so it's this really like amazing perspective on, a much broader view of the industry than I think people like me have, who are just relatively new to the space. So really excited to hear all your thoughts on these different tools. I should also mention that, like, you talked about how you were in the Fast AI sort of community and making some contributions there. Just for those who aren't familiar with that space, some contributions covers like a shocking amount of work. Hamel is one of the most like helpful contributors that I know, and not just in one place, like in all these different projects and forums and answering questions and building new features. So it's been really, really fun to watch this kind of ecosystem grow as people like yourself, other people in the community, come together to like augment this library and then all this associated tooling, and all just trying to figure out how things work together to make them better. So it's been a real privilege to like watch all that happen, and I'm so excited for the thing that you mentioned where you now get to like formally do that full time as opposed to sneaking it in on the side around those other jobs. So really great to see that experience, and I'm looking forward to quizzing you on some of that further.
Yeah, and I should mention something about Wasim. So Wasim is actually doing this full-time venture, commercializing Fast AI with us, and we met Wasim in open source. We're very impressed by him. So at the moment, it's three of us, Jeremy, Wasim, and I, doing this Fast AI Labs, or commercializing Fast AI. We haven't announced anything yet of what we're doing or what we're calling it. We're still figuring that out.
World premiere here, folks.
Yeah, world premiere. I want to actually give the audience a little bit background on how I met you, if that's okay.
Yeah, sure. I'm about to ask about MBDev, but let's stall before we get to that.
Yeah. So I actually didn't know who you were, and I think I put on Twitter one day that, hey, I want to meet people that live around me, and you responded that you were visiting Portland. You were going to be visiting Portland at the time. I had no idea who you were, and it was one of these phases where I was very open to meeting people. I'm not necessarily go out of my way to meet new people per se. I kind of live at home and work at home, and I don't really get to. So it was very intentional on my part, just going with the flow. Like whoever responds, I'm going to meet them, no matter who it is. And I remember meeting you at the coffee shop, and you telling me about what you were doing, and I was very impressed by it. And then, what really impressed me was, the things that you're working on, stable diffusion and generative AI. It is very cutting edge, and really at that time there was nobody that understood it. Like it was very much kind of maybe academia, and maybe some PhDs that understood it. Maybe people who can read these papers and really understand, but it wasn't really accessible to the general public. And through some strokes of luck, somehow, I think so. Jeremy also got excited about this, and similarly, he was confused. But then when you started, I think we all leaned on you to explain it to us. All stable diffusion, how does it work? And the way that you went about explaining to us, you did it in like plain English terms. That was very intuitive, and it really is impressive because to be able to do that, to explain stable diffusion in plain English, that means you really understand what you're doing. Like it's really hard to explain something in plain English. Like you have to go deep and understand what is happening. Maybe even you probably understand it better than people in academia, I would argue, because I find that when people explain things in plain English, um, just like it reminds me of the Richard Feynman mentality of like explain things in plain English.
Yeah, yeah,
So
I
that's
really like that,
and
and
it's
I have to say, like,
yeah
half of that understanding comes from having like those initial discussions that we were all having, where you've got this audience of people who can say, okay, what was that meaning, or was that similar to this? And so, like, I don't want people to get the idea that it was like this unidirectional transfer. It was like all of us simultaneously, like picking all of this apart, and I think slowly, yeah, building a bit of that deep intuition, which hopefully we'll be able to
yeah
communicate. I think that's the goal. Hey.
yeah, and your notebooks were really amazing. So I feel like it was the first time I could understand what stable diffusion was because you really peeled it away and made it very creative and simplifying the concepts as much as possible to the most basic principles in such a way that you really don't have to. It was the most accessible way to learn it that I've seen, and it immediately clicked and made sense because you stripped away all the parts, but except for the bare minimum, to where it really was very straightforward, and you could look at it. It wasn't that many lines of code after you stripped it down and simplified it for everybody. So I thought that was really impressive because to get to that point, you must you found a way to understand all this stuff, which I want to ask you about, like how you did that, like how did you go about that. So that's one thing that impressed me. Second thing that impressed me is I know that you live in Zimbabwe, and you a lot of times don't even have electricity, and basically like you have a lot less resources than most people do out there, like than a lot of people do in this world. And you are highly productive, and also you figure out all these things and you're teaching this course. And I think a lot of people have a lot, you've overcome all these obstacles, to be something, to do something highly impactful. And yeah, and then so at that moment I knew, okay, this is somebody to follow. Like this person is legitimate. Like this is an up and coming ML person that is going to really make a high impact in this world because you've overcome a lot of obstacles, and kind of to be one of the first person I saw to really kind of teach stable diffusion and all these other generative things that I kind of thought were really complicated in this way. I thought that was amazing. So I actually want to ask you about that too. And then another reason I got excited is because you mentioned you might be my neighbor soon. So in the Portland, you might be moving to Portland. So that is super exciting as well. It's always nice to have people like this around that I can meet in the physical space. So I just want to let people know about that.
Cool.
And I think it actually reminds me a lot of like Jeremy, the way Jeremy works, like meeting you and watching the way you work. And also, it's quite fascinating that you you're doing a lot of this stuff just, you're doing it for free, like, kind of putting this knowledge out there, curating it, putting tremendous effort into teaching people these things. And it really reminds me of the same ethos, of like how Jeremy has gone about things. So yeah, I would like to ask you about that too. So I have a lot of questions for you,
Okay.
as
Shall I
well.
try and go through them in?
Yeah, yeah. So the first thing, so
Hmm.
let's kind of go through the first thing is, so how did you start to understand like all of this stuff? Like, you know, do you have an academic background, or how did you go about it? What was your way of kind of going through all these highly technical concepts that no one understood and breaking them down into things that you understand? Like, how did you do that?
So I think so. Yeah, that's a good one to start. I think my background has been very lucky. You know, you're talking about like, oh, you've got all these unlucky circumstances of like where you are and stuff, but I've been very fortunate in a number of ways within that. For yeah, like throwing myself in the deep end and having to figure things out. Um, you know, that might not have happened in other places. So like, for example, before I even went off to university, I was on projects and it was like I'm the computer guy, right? And it's not like there's hundreds of other people who do like geospatial stuff or mapping or anything. There's no other people there, so you've kind of just like got to figure this stuff out. And so very early on, I kind of had that idea of like, yeah, actually, if you're willing to like dive in and ask questions and be a little bit clueless for a bit, I don't know, like that to me is quite a skill to say, okay, I don't understand this, let me try. I don't understand this, let me try. And I think what other places maybe people will go, I don't understand this, let me get someone else in, or I don't understand this, there's that barrier. When you don't have that, it's like, well, I've got to figure this stuff out. Like, I'm the only one who can do computers, and now I need to make a species distribution model, or whatever the case is. Um, yeah, it's kind of an addictive worldview because then you start to see a lot of other things in that frame. So, in terms of this, like generative, this particular case, I mean, I had background in coding for many years, so that's helpful. I had background in machine learning from again a number of years of like projects and things like that. But what really helped with say Stable Diffusion is that I'd spent the whole previous year kind of playing around with this stuff. First of all, as kind of like I actually got into AI art almost as like a recovery from burnout. Here's like a low consequence, fun new thing to play with. To then like trying to teach it to other people because that's one of the ways I try and understand things is like make a bad tutorial, okay, make a better tutorial, try and figure out like how to fit these pieces into people's brains. And so by the time it came to like when diffusion models started coming out, and then when this big release of Stable Diffusion came, I had this whole history of well, I've seen lots of similar things, so I've got maybe more analogies to draw on. Plus, I've just been messing around with this kind of code and with some of the precursors to this. So knowing which files to look at in so and so's repo, or which ideas are probably going to be coming up again, all that was helpful. And then yeah, like I think the grokking Stable Diffusion notebook that I put out was just literally that was my process, right? Like here's this thing, it seems really fancy, but my assumption is that we can break it and understand it and hack it, because that's worked before. Yeah, so let's break it down. Let's look at the code. Let's copy and paste bits. Like try and get it working. And then I think one of the reasons why I mean, that's by far the thing of mine that's seen the most people, and vice versa, is because it wasn't like I'm an academic and I've written this paper and I'm sharing it from a place of like knowledge. I'm not sharing from a place of knowledge. I'm sharing from a place of like I'm just figuring this stuff out. And so maybe that like beginner point of view, okay, it's not beginner because I've got this history, but it is beginner because I am still figuring all this stuff out. I think that might be maybe what helps to make it something that I can communicate. Yeah, so that's an attempt at an
That's
answer.
amazing. See, you mentioned something really interesting, which is, so you mentioned resource constraints, which I think is fundamentally a really powerful force in machine learning research in general. Like when people don't have unlimited compute, or they don't have an army of people to work with, and they are forced pragmatically to figure lots of things out, I think a lot of good things come out of it. And so you mentioned, okay, you were, and that's fascinating. You mentioned that you were lucky. You said you were lucky to be resource constrained. Like you were the only person there, that could even deal with the computer. That's a really interesting viewpoint. A lot of people don't necessarily always view that as something that they lucked into, let's say. So can you tell me more about that? Like, have you always sort of kind of leaned into this resource constraint? Like in what other ways kind of are you resource constrained that you've had to be creative? Like I know, like, I brought up the electricity thing. You brought up, okay, you're usually on teams where you're the only technical person. Like you meant, it sounds like you're the only person that maybe knows how to use a computer at all,
Okay,
which
no,
is wild.
it's not quite that bad. I mean,
Uh,
Zimbabwe's pretty
okay.
backward, but no, it wasn't that bad. It was just that on a few of these particular projects, it's been people who have really deep knowledge in like ecology or the sort of like local government structures and how to work through those. But in terms of like programming a computer to make it like do novel things, it's like email is a little scary. So there's like nice synergies there, and I like being the person with a different set of tools to come and do that. But yeah, like, I mean, there's in terms of like being able to make a plan and deal with resource constraints. I think this is a whole country of people who've had to learn how to do that just from necessity. Like I'm by far in the luckiest percentile of people here in that I can buy a battery backup and an inverter and a solar panel to wheel around and charge the laptops and things. So, there's definitely people who have it much harder. I think relatively I've had it pretty easy. And that's something that we discussed when I was in Portland is like, that's my first trip to the States, right? And it's wow, like this does feel, I know there's difficulties everywhere and so on, but it really did feel like this is like easy mode. Um, what the heck?
Definitely.
So yeah, that has been a good thing. I mean, yeah, in all the places where we've had that constraint, I think another one that springs to mind is Zindi, which was a data science competitions platform, very much like Kaggle, but started, with a very deep focus on African context and the kinds of problems that we're facing here. And that also a company, I wasn't the only data scientist there, but I was maybe the one who had the most time and like deep learning side to focus on that, which was again really cool. But yeah, that whole company was about like, we don't have the kinds of data that overseas companies have, right? We're dealing with like much smaller, much earlier in the like data pipeline companies. So trying to just hack around and get things working in this more resource constrained environment. Yeah, I find that very, very interesting. And I think you do learn, yeah, how to make things work when you don't have, like you were saying, you don't have the infinite bandwidth compute, you know, resources, human resources available. You do have to kind of figure things out and do them more efficiently.
Yeah. It reminds me of this tweet that I saw the other day by Nassim Taleb saying something like, if you find a lawyer of the same rank from a no-name school versus a lawyer from Harvard, go with the no-name school one because that person from the no-name school to get to that same level has, did not hide behind any bullshit. Like they are going to be really really good because you know they've kind of probably cut their teeth in a different way. So it reminds me of you, like in that sense. So I think that's really interesting. Do you think that there's a way to find more people like you in Zimbabwe or other places? I feel that we have found at FastAI, we found someone sort of like, I mean, kind of like that with Wasim. He's from South Africa. Um, but like, I feel like this is an untapped, there's a lot of untapped talent out there that kind of in the US especially tend to forget about. We
Mm.
kind of are very myopic on our own country a lot of times. So just curious,
Yeah.
like, what do you think about that stuff?
I mean, that is that is something that I think is pretty doable. And one of the ways that you do that is just by making things a bit more accessible, right? So if I look at when I tried to first do some deep learning, I had no GPU. Internet was like 100 kilobytes a second, so downloading a big pre-trained model was really painful. And then it would be like, now I've got some TensorFlow error, and I can't even run this thing. And so if you look at now, contrast that to a tool like Google Colab, where we've had people doing these indie competitions. They're coding on a phone, right? With Google Colab, it's a free GPU in the cloud. They're using some library like FastAI or something that's very user friendly. Um, and so yeah, that's a whole bunch of people who like if you had to like okay cool download a big TensorFlow model, run it locally, do this that and
That's
the other.
fascinating. So let me just be
Mhm.
clear. You're saying people are entering these Kaggle-like competitions and the writing all this code for those competitions on their phone.
Oh yeah,
Their
yeah.
phone.
I've seen a lot of people here in Zim doing that. Where it's, I mean, ideally you have like some beaten up old like 10-year-old laptop or something that you can at least use a keyboard. But no, I've seen people Bluetooth keyboard into the phone or even just like touch typing like this. Because if it's accessible enough, right, you download the starter notebook, you've got a template, maybe you're editing a few things, you're trying a few experiments. Like that barrier to entry, then that person's hooked or they find a little internship and then they get a proper computer and then they're in. So as soon as you can get that like accessibility of entry down, yeah, I feel like we will start seeing a lot more of this kind of further out talent coming in, where you don't have to be at a university that has a cluster or a big institution that has some funding. You can just like find these tools and
That is amazing to me. That someone would say that someone would be that hungry that they would say, you know what? I'm going to just take my phone, attach a Bluetooth keyboard to it, and start coding and enter a Kaggle competition from my phone that's using Google Colab. I'm pretty sure that people in the US, if that was their only modality, they would just give up. They wouldn't do it. They would say, I can't do it. I'm not doing this. So that is super impressive to me that people are that hungry that they would say, you know what, I want to get involved that badly. I'm going to I'm going to like whatever the constraints are, I'm going to find a way. That is amazing. That really blows my mind actually.
yeah, it's a pretty cool community. So yeah. Um,
So
mhm.
accessibility, that's really interesting. So like, that's really fascinating to hear that from you about accessibility. I didn't really sort of internalize the impact that accessibility has
Mm. Well, I mean, another thing
fully
is
until
like
I heard you say that.
it also feeds into things like so you've asked me and a few other people have asked me like why don't you charge for this course or why da da da, and like that again, if you have to sign up for something with a credit card, that wipes out like half the people on this continent here. If you have to like fork over, oh it's $10 a month, like it's easy, it's like well that's yeah, several days labor in some places. So yeah, all of that falls under that umbrella of like if you can somehow lower that barrier to entry, then yeah, I think that's how you'll get those people who are, you know, out there and figuring things out with those resource constraints. Um, what we
And do
talk
you still
about,
have those like with the internet speeds? Is it still
no, thankfully
a constraint?
that was like 2014 where, if you were like hundreds of kilobytes a second, it was pretty nice. I mean, some people had fancy fiber, but yeah, since then it's gotten a lot better and mobile data's fairly cheap and available. I mean, it's still relatively expensive for what people earn here, but that kind of infrastructure is at least a lot better.
What would you like to see from accessibility perspective in terms of more accessibility? What do you think is where do you think the opportunities might be?
Well, I mean, so things like access to compute for these big models is always going to be a holdup for some people, and I think there's people working on that to do like more things like collab or grant programs or whatever else. In terms of like making the workflow easier, something like Replit. I don't know if you've seen Replit have been launching a lot of like voice coding, mobile coding, really easy, like no environment setup stuff. Things like that is going to be, I mean, that's much more broadly, that's not just like a financial barrier, that's just, it's, if it's 5 times easier to write some code, more people will be writing code. So I think that's a big thing. And then education, so that people know like what to do, is maybe the place where there's lots of stuff out there, but there's still, I think, a lot of space for either like curating or recommending resources, or like creating new stuff that's very targeted and very easy for people to get in.
That's amazing. So I do want to ask you. I mean, I can probably just interview you the whole
Yeah,
time,
yeah,
which
we
is
might want to
totally
turn it
fine.
around slightly, but
I want to ask you one more question, if that's
mhm.
okay. Which is, okay, you're a very talented ML person. You know, you have some visibility. You do spend a lot of time sort of with this socially, like this social good type of work where you offer very high quality free education to lots of people. And can you talk a little bit about what motivates you? I mean, you could go and, let's say, focus on just making money, with your time, but you spend a significant amount of your time every day. It appears to be maybe even most of your time, with these sort of educating everybody about ML, um, kind of in a very selfless way, I think. I mean, you don't charge for these courses, and I know that you mentioned, you mentioned you learn through teaching, which I want to talk about.
Mm.
But can you just describe, like, how did you how did you get to this place where how do you think about that?
This,
Like, how did you sort of arrive at like this way of working?
um, this is the by far the most introspection I've done in one of these interviews. Thanks for that. Um, there's a couple of things. So I mean, one, I come from a family of educators. My dad's a pretty amazing teacher, and so I've always had that like bent of this is a good thing, and we always like
What does your dad teach?
junior school, so everything science, maths, the normal class stuff. But he'll work in far more like exotic topics. He can't. If someone comes to read our electricity meter, there's like a 50-50 chance he'll teach them how to light a fire with a stick or some cool thing about some invention he's made. So yeah, just a compulsive educator, I would call him. So I've inherited a bit of that. I think being in, I mean, below the poverty line in the US for a lot of our lives, but that's in the top few percent here. So being in that like relative position, it's always nice to like you learn to help each other out, and then Zimbabwe is very reciprocal. You help people out, then you have tough times, they help you out. We've been on the receiving end of that from a lot of people when times are tough, and then vice versa. So I think you get that sort of attitude there. For me, a lot of the motivation right now is that I could try and find some work here. We've chatted about the pay differential. I could probably find some international work if I wanted. But I kind of have this perspective of like you said, we might move to the US at some point. And if so, then it's probably going to be like 10x easier to find those jobs that do bring in a bit more income. So for me now, it didn't make sense to like chase a shorter term thing. I think you making me out as very selfless. This things like this course really do help in that. Um, yeah, it's letting me learn things with a focus that I definitely couldn't do on the side of a full time job, and then it's also giving like an image out there of like people kind of know, okay, oh wait, he's the guy who did that diffusion models course, which come the time when I do eventually decide that I should probably earn some dollars will be very handy. Um, but yeah, I
That makes a
guess
lot of sense.
mhm, yeah.
Yeah, like watching you teach, it does remind me. So it does feel like you do this a lot. Like you learn through teaching,
Mm,
and it does remind me a lot of Jeremy in the sense Jeremy's been learning through teaching as well for a long time. Like you can look and see courses on Angular JS and all kinds of stuff. They've been doing. I get the sense like you may have been doing this too, for some time. Beyond just the generative AI stuff, what other kinds of things have you kind of done this learning through teaching approach through?
um, well, I don't know. I'd say definitely like so. a side thing here that I do is very much like the citizen science and naturalism stuff, like documenting what species are around, that sort of thing. That I love. Like you get to get other people excited about nature. Um,
And
but
just to be clear, is that going out into nature and kind of cataloging different types of insects you see? What is that? What can you describe that a little bit more?
sure, it's a slight sidetrack, but yeah, getting people, just using their phone to take photos of like plants or insects or whatever the case may be, because at the moment, like the biodiversity that we have is pretty like endangered. Like there's a lot of habitat pressure on a large portion of the country. There's a lot of tree loss and things like that. And so there's this kind of dual thing of like getting people excited about what's there so that they can conserve it, but then also just documenting like for future reference what was here in case things are lost. And so trying to build up a better picture of like what the environment looks like. So I mean that's very much like tangential to tech, but it's also like the way I learned how to identify spiders was getting people to send pictures of spiders and then be like, oh, I think I know what this is, and then in figuring that out, you learn that. Um, for me, like the whole of my data science journey, I got into it mostly through like initially as a helping out making a course, and so that was very much addictive, and that's what I ended up doing mostly with like the Zindi stuff. I liked sourcing the data and preparing the baselines and things, but what I really enjoyed was making the tutorials and seeing people like take them and put their own spin on them. And that again was like, I need to learn how to do NLP now because I promised to make a like starter notebook for this text classification challenge. So it was a very good motivator to, yeah, learn a lot of those things.
That's fantastic. And the people watching this, can they find those things easily? How can you find these other courses or maybe these other tutorials that you've made? Is there a website or something that may contain those?
Yeah, I mean, if you go to like, so Zindi.Africa is the data science competitions platform, that'll have pretty much any competition up until last year, early last year. If it has a tutorial or a starter notebook, that was probably me. But otherwise, like I have my blog and Twitter. If people feel like scrolling back far enough, they'll see all sorts of weird and wacky tutorials on things like satellite imagery or, you know, image classification with fast AI as I figure out what a cool library that is. Early days.
Yeah. So that's really interesting. Now, you know, one question is, so you've done all this stuff. I mean, you've taught a lot of people how to do machine learning, lots of courses, lots of, also in a very unique approach, I would say, because of the resource constraints and this just general attitude about learning through teaching. You've definitely caught the zeitgeist in terms of like something very popular right now, which is the generative AI. It was definitely also a very good time to be doing a course like this, I think. Have you thought about what's next? I mean, what would what have you thought about? Okay, what's kind of do you have plans or do you work just intuitively to kind of when something comes up, you say you want to learn that and you do it, or kind of how do you? Yeah, give us a picture about the future a little bit.
So don't be misled by the sticky notes behind me. I very much don't have a plan with a lot of things. Whenever I was like trying to articulate what I wanted to be when I grew up or what I wanted to do, it was I have too short of an attention span to like stick in one field and say I do this kind of thing and that's what I'm doing for the next 50 years. So I'm much more like if I can find somewhere where I get to learn new things and get to like figure out problems, then that's great. And so I can see the next little while probably sticking with generative AI. It's very exciting. There's lots of fun problems. But I could also see like, going back to electrical engineering once I'm somewhere where you can actually order parts and they come in the mail. That could be pretty fun. Or getting into like, I don't know, 3D design for like VR and that sort of thing. There's lots of other avenues that would probably scratch that itch. But for me, deep learning is really
Have you tinkered with those things before? Those
Yeah.
other things, electrical engineering, 3D modeling? You have?
Yeah.
Okay.
I mean, those are
Is
all.
that something you did before machine learning and then you sort of got into machine learning, or you've been kind of in parallel tinkering with these things?
Like hobby electronics was something I was into way before even coding. That was like a from junior school love of making things move and work. And one of the reasons I learned coding was so that I could program little robots and things. So that's definitely something that could come back. But no, mostly, yeah, just along the side as hobbies. And they all play into each other. Like if I build something electrical, I can add machine learning to it. If I'm art and nature, I can figure out a way of like making that a data science question rather than just, we'll look pretty pictures. So yeah, they all kind of intertwine. The thing with deep learning at the moment feels like it's pretty high leverage, and so if I was to choose, like, I could do some cool 3D stuff, but that would be quite self-indulgent. Whereas I feel like just handing as many people as possible this tool that is deep learning and generative, like, let's be clear, generative models are really cool, but they're also just a really sneaky way to slip in this more general idea of like, hey, deep learning is a thing. And if you take a course on how to make AI art, what you're actually learning is like optimization and deep neural networks and all these crazy tricks. And so I suspect I might stick around here for a while longer, at least, just because that feels like such a high leverage, high impact thing to be giving other people. Like, here's these really, really powerful tools.
Yeah. Now you say it's self-indulgent. I mean, now if you know about electronics and 3D printing, I think sometimes the most interesting machine learning projects or knowledge is actually not necessarily the machine learning itself, but the glue on how you kind of bring machine learning into the world or like pair it with another domain. So this is really interesting that you know stuff about electronics, and 3D printing. It sounds like that might be a super interesting course. Like basics of, I don't know, making something like that it sounds like a lot of fun, actually. Can get into the physical world a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, that'd be nice. We'll see. This conversation is going to be up on the internet, so I'll probably be looking back from some completely different point in a couple of years and say, what the heck were we going on about? Or maybe we should pick that up again. Anyway, I want to turn it back to you because we got very sidetracked interrogating Jono here. And something that ties into a lot of what we've been discussing and this kind of like meta thing of like, how do you, what do you work on and how do you do things? So one of the ways I'd summarize your interests, if I might be so bold, is to like look at this class of things that is tooling, right? You mentioned working on tooling at various companies, and these days it's all about like, how do I give people a tool for blogging, right? Like you made that fast pages thing. How do I make it easy for people to share technical material online? Because I think that's a good thing. NBDev, which maybe if you want to introduce it, this might be a good point. But yeah, so just what is your thoughts around that? Because I feel like what you're doing with tooling is very much what you're doing with education. It's trying to make it easier for people to do things. And so yeah, what are your thoughts on that? And maybe if you want to introduce NBDev as like the current focus tool and why that's exciting.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, so you mentioned Fast Pages, so I'll talk a little bit about the background of that. So Fast Pages is a project I created out of frustration because it was really difficult at the time to write a blog with notebooks. I mean, sure, you could put a notebook on GitHub, but you couldn't really, it was really difficult to make it into a blog. If you wanted to style it, if you wanted to hide some cells, show some cells, you wanted to actually make it part of a blog site, you had to go pretty deep into a lot of things. And it was quite complicated. There was some stuff out there that people kind of bootstrapped, but, nothing that easy to use. And I thought this is a big problem because fundamentally, the science part of data science and kind of critical part of science is sharing information. That's like the heart of science is, when you do or when you learn something new, you need to communicate with the world. Otherwise it never happened. It doesn't really, I don't know if it really counts, as science per se. If you're not writing it down, recording it, so other people can have a discussion with you or reproduce your experiment or, to learn from you. And also at the time, when I was taking the Fast AI course for the first time. So one thing that Fast AI teaches you is not only this like machine learning stuff, it also teaches you a lot about marketing and the power of communication. So hey, you should write a blog. Okay, but why? I mean, everyone thinks that's silly. Like blog, who's gonna read my blog? It's just gonna go. It's gonna be like I'm whispering into a forest, or like
Mm.
nobody hears me. And then what's the point? But actually, like it's very surprising. There's a big push in fast AI courses to do that, to really, to write down what you learn, be very shameless, be very don't be afraid, don't worry about is this cool enough, or maybe do people already know this, or this is not unique. Don't worry about all that stuff. Just write it down. And the thing that I think that's intuitive is there's not that many people that create content on the internet. You think, I mean, the internet feels like a vast place that's infinite, but at the same time, not that many people actually take time to write things down. And there's always an audience for everybody, for every skill level. The thing that is going to resonate with a very experienced person is very different than what's going to resonate with a beginner. Kind of like what you said. Maybe your non-traditional background really helped you with communication with your audience. And I think this was a problem in some sense because people couldn't go from their notebooks to blog posts. It's very painful, copying and pasting code everywhere,
Screenshotting code.
and screenshotting code. And, what if you want to change your code, you got to redo all the screenshots. And I thought this is really getting in the way of, this is like a lot of friction that people experience with technical communication. Doesn't really make any sense. Can we just make it to where you can just save a notebook into a folder and it just becomes a blog post and you can have some way of hiding cells? So then I realized NBDev kind of had some components of that. And so at the time I made Fast Pages sort of built on NBDev to just do the documentation part of it. Just a blog. Like you don't have to write software or anything like that, but you just do the blog. So that was really cool. I worked on that. And I felt that really helped. A lot of people from the Fast AI community use Fast Pages as a way of, sharing their sharing stuff they're working on. I think it really helped because people could just go from their notebook directly into a post, like without much friction. And, because you already write your notebook like a blog post anyway. So that was, that was there. And I think, so I got really fascinated by NBDev as well. Kind of going into the same frame of mind of it's equally important to communicate with people when you're writing code. Like let's say it's not a blog post, say you're writing software, creating an API for people to use. Nothing frustrates me more than looking at code that's not documented well. It is, this idea that you should just read the source code and that is the documentation. It makes me very angry when I hear that. I think that's, that's not being empathetic to probably, your audience. And it doesn't really work well. And so, I think that was important. I think it was fascinating to me for that reason. And also, just as I was, as a Python developer, I think we all experience this friction. Maybe we have put it into our subconscious or ignore it. However, most Python developers, I think all Python developers, experience deep friction because they have to live in two worlds, like your REPL notebook and your IDE. And you're authoring scripts in an IDE, Python scripts, and you're constantly going back and forth between a REPL in your IDE. And while it doesn't seem like a big deal for some people, it adds up. The accumulation of constantly context switching it has a tremendous cognitive load because you're constantly copying and pasting from here to there, and that just leads into like slower thinking and slower, you know, just velocity. And like moving, being able to like reduce context switching is very important, and not just software engineering, but in also any task, any productive task, any creative task that you do. Um, and to kind of meld the process of experimenting with software and writing software to bring it into one context, to where the person creating the software can interact with it in a humane way. I think it's not a new idea. It is something that's been popularized in many different venues. One, I think one really good champion of like this approach is Brett Victor. Brett
Mm.
Victor has some really great presentations where he's done some very early explorations of these ideas. It's like programming in a way that allows you to experiment with the software, but also like write it at the same time without living in two different worlds. And so, um, and there's also Donald Knuth, which is a little bit more academic in this ideas of literate programming, and he had some attempts that didn't quite take off, and become super popular. But when I saw MBDev, I said, "Wow, okay, this is a software development workflow that allows you to author your code in the notebook, but also stay in the notebook, but author really high quality software. We're not talking about, oh,
Mm.
okay, just slap it together, sloppy notebook, just launch your notebook, just throw the notebook over the fence. No,
Yeah.
that's not what it is. You write a lot of, so as affordances for tests, documentation. It removes all the friction from documentation. It removes, in my opinion, friction from writing tests, because you don't need to go to a separate file to make tests, to write tests. You don't have to think about mocks in the same way. Mocks are more natural.
Mm.
Mocks are just cells in a notebook that are not part of the source code, and it's all in one context. And when I was very skeptical. Okay, so when I saw this, I was like, who is this guy? There's no, I mean, you know, okay, right, okay, we're gonna create software notebooks. I've been told, from people that this is a bad idea, but let me just give it a shot, because this Jeremy guy seems like he's interesting, like he's productive. There's something going on with this Jeremy guy. I'm just gonna look into it because I'm not gonna just write it off.
Mm.
I
Yeah.
can't. There's something going on. I'm just super curious. This might be something interesting. So I got into it, and it totally blew my mind. I was immediately, I would say, 100 times more productive and happier. I actually, started to deeply enjoy writing software. It became fun. Became like when someone asked me to do something, to write a tool at work, I would be happy. I would say, yeah, this is great. I'm gonna create a project that has tests, lots of documentation, has a documentation website and CI. I'm gonna just give them something. It's like very polished, and I could do
Yeah.
that with MBDev, and and I can't do that very easily with other like in like their traditional way. So I thought, okay, this is magic in a bottle. Like I need to. I have found that thing. A lot of it's a lot of like startup advice books out there. I don't really know if any of them are good, but one kind of piece of advice that resonates with me is find the thing that you think is the best kept secret out there. What is this thing that you think is a secret that nobody knows, that you think is transformative? And that's the thing that maybe you should lean into.
Mm.
So for me, that was MBDev. It's like, wow, okay, no one, not that many people know about it, relatively speaking, and it is completely blow my mind. And I didn't make up my mind about this overnight, mind you.
Yeah.
I used MBDev over the period of 3 years to write lots of different software. So I used it not just for machine learning projects, but also used it to build like API clients. So we built a Python API client for the GitHub API. So the GitHub does not offer a Python client for their API, like officially. They offer a Ruby client. They offer obviously this is a REST API endpoint.
Mm.
So they maintain themselves like a Ruby client and a JavaScript client, but there's no Python client. And so, we were able to write that in MBDev. Similarly, we're also able to write terminal user interfaces in MBDev. And all kinds of other things where you might think superficially that notebooks are not good for, but it's not really about notebooks at all. It's not, we were taking a completely different view of notebooks. We're reimagining what notebooks could be and not, we're thinking outside the box of what a notebook should be and what it is used for. We happen to, in MBDev, we think that notebooks are vastly misunderstood and the thinking around them is constrained to just like the scratch pad. But really, it's an amazing REPL execution environment, so on and so forth. Anyways, that's a long-winded way of saying, this is how I got into MBDev and why I think it is one of the best kept secrets, in software development generally. And I think, we want to make it not a secret. And this is why I'm working on it. That's why I'm betting my entire, that's why I'm betting on it so heavily by, leaving my job and deciding to work on this type of stuff full time. But then also, so just to be clear, it's not just I'm betting on just MBDev, it's also I'm betting on, there might be other things in the fast AI ecosystem that might be worth commercializing in some way. And then it's also just betting on the talent. So obviously Jeremy is very talented. Wasim is very talented. And then in a more latent way, there's this really large community of people that have been accumulated for some, 5 or more years that are they're very much like-minded. And there's a lot of talented people in there like yourself. Like I would say like some of the world's most talented people like show up in the fast AI community. So people like you, Tanish, whoever it might be, and that is also I'm betting on that too, because that is, you could argue, communities of talented people are the world's most precious resources. One of is the world's most precious resource in a lot of ways, especially when it comes to thinking about doing some kind of company. Now I don't know what that means, like what that this community talent. I just know that there's something different about this community than all the other communities I've been part of, and that this community is very interested in like these projects moving forward. And so there's something there. I don't know how that manifests itself into some commercial thing, but there's something there that I think is important to nurture, and maybe it somehow some commercial venture does end up leveraging the power of the community. I would think it does.
Yeah, I'm pretty sure that's a safe bet. Something I wanted to ask you. So MBDev, and I mean, I've had this experience. A lot of people who've tried to have this experience where, as a programmer, you get used to it, and then you go, "Wow, this I'm like 3 times more productive, or 5 times more productive, or some scalar factor." But the thing that I'm wondering if you've considered, like, okay, it's really cool handing existing programmers some extra superpower, but if you look at like what it takes to program, especially what it took like when we were all getting into this, on the opposite end of the scale to NBDev is like embedded development or something like that, where I'm
Mm.
writing an assembly code, I'm executing the program in my head because the compile time is like 5 minutes. You're trying to like memorize register. So that kind of programming, and even like typing in this file, going to that file, running it here, it rewards like the percentage of the population who've got really good like working memory and can do that kind of mental juggling. But that's hard, right? Like there's a reason people fail out of those courses is because not everyone can just like keep 10 register addresses in their head. And so I'm sure you've thought about like, oh, NVDev, I feel way more productive. I bet a lot of good programmers will feel way more productive. But if you look at like, and the example that I've got in my head is the blog post that you shared like yesterday of creating a Gradio interface with NVDev. And it's like, here's a tutorial that also writes all the code, that also becomes the app, that shows the app in line. And it's like, you don't have to do any of that. You don't have to have that working memory. So if I'm a non-programmer and coding like that old school way was just inaccessible because of how I think or how I work, I feel like I could look at that notebook and go, I can do that, right? Like it's all there. Every line of code has some explanation around it. You can edit things and see what they do. You know, you run the final thing, you get your demo, and then you hit NBDev export, and it's like, bam, now you can host that on Hugging Face. And this combination of like libraries like Gradio, FastAI, libraries like, you know, NBDev, this notebook environment, hosting and things like that, all getting easier. I don't know, it feels like this isn't just like, oh, double your productivity as an existing programmer. This feels like you couldn't program because the tools were really bad, and now maybe you can program. So I wonder if you've like thought of that aspect of it as like a gateway into things rather than just a tool for people who already do this kind of thing.
Yeah, no, we are very sensitive to on ramps to the extent where we think very carefully about things like can we eliminate the terminal?
Mm.
Not eliminate it meaning we not support it. Eliminate it means you don't have to use it if you don't want to. You know, can you do everything from the notebook? Because we know that a lot of people get scared of the terminal. When you're first approaching programming or things like that, you might look at a terminal and say, "Wow, that is an alien interface with the computer that I've never seen before." Like, what do you mean I'm going to type commands into this black screen and it's going to do things? That's a little bit, and that's separate from the code I'm writing and what is going on. What is that? It's a whole operating system, right? Like,
Yeah.
to kind of worry about this entire operating system that is quite different than operating system you might have been using before. Like even don't even challenges what you think operating systems mean. So yeah, we do think about that quite a lot. We want to, part of the kind of commercial thinking is, can we have like a hosted service that makes it very easy to get started, where you can, click some buttons, do things like that. You don't have to worry about Git. Git is very difficult.
Mm.
I take it for granted,
Yeah.
but I think it is fairly complicated. And there's a lot of things. There's a lot of paper cuts, like setting up your development environment. You mentioned Replit, and I think that is really, experienced developers may not understand Replit, but I get it, because setting up your environment is painful. It gets me, once every couple of weeks, like pretty good. And you see a lot of the market for that is healthy. Like there's Replit. GitHub just announced, more robust code spaces, which tackles like this exact same problem. I mean, people setting up a development environment, it can be very complicated. And so there's a lot of paper cuts, and we want to make it easy. And then also, there's kind of this, like the most ambitious goal of FastAI is to make it to where people can leverage machine learning without having to code at all. So it's kind of, we're trying to go in that gradient towards that situation. I think it is more of a aspirational goal.
Mm.
I'm not sure if it's possible to eliminate coding. But certainly, I mean, maybe it is. I don't know what that looks like, but I can say on the journey to trying to make make that easier, where you code less and less, make it more accessible, then then I think you might come up with something really good. And this is to say, this is not a trade-off where you lose. It's not where MBDev simplifies things and makes a lot of assumptions for you in such a way that you can't do complicated things anymore. It's not like that at all.
Yeah.
We've actually we've actually figured out, okay, how do we make it easier but give you the full power of Python? To just allow you to not context switch so much. So I mean that we're finding that we're trying to zone into that area where what is the unnecessary complexity in removing that versus the necessary complexity.
Yeah. Well, I think that's such an exciting goal, and it's really, yeah, this conversation and just watching the space has me so amped for like what learning looks like and what coding looks like and all of this going forward. And I think, yeah, you hit the nail on the head where you said all the way along this journey, even if we don't get to aspirational goal at the end of it, like there's such a lot of value to be had along that thing. Hamel, this has been such an amazing conversation. I think that's definitely like probably double the record for length of the discussions here. But I so appreciate you coming on and sharing all of this. We might have to do a follow-up episode, potentially, depending on
Yeah,
how
I
much.
really enjoyed getting to know you better. I honestly got to know you a lot better in this conversation.
Likewise.
And
Well,
I think a
that's
lot of people should get to know you better.
well, you did a very good job being the interviewer on this podcast and flipping the tables. So yeah, thank you for that. I did want to ask my sort of traditional ending question is to just see if there's any tips that you have. So specifically for you, you've had this thing of like contributing in all these various places, and much before any sort of formal, like now you're formally working on it, but even before then, being involved and creating these different tools. Do you have tips for people who are saying, okay, like that looks really good, and maybe they're excited about MBDev, or maybe they're excited about some other thing, but they want to start contributing and saying like, how can I be part of building this? What would your advice be for someone in that position? Like, how do you start down that road where you're doing the kinds of contributions that you've been doing?
Yeah, try to find some kind of niche where you think that you have something to add, and it can be boring. It doesn't have to be glamorous, like I'm going to implement a new model architecture in Fast AI, or I'm going to improve an optimizer or something like that. The way that I got involved with Fast AI was probably the most unglamorous way you could probably get involved with it, which is really two things. One is started writing a lot of documentation. I was trying to learn how stuff worked and I couldn't understand it. And the documentation was not good, in my opinion. So, I mean, I didn't complain about it. What I did is I learned how to make the pull request correctly with MBDev and just start updating the documentation. Because, and documentation is amazing because if you do a good job of updating documentation, virtually no maintainer is going to say no to that. It's pretty low risk with, relative to code.
Yeah.
And, they'll be highly appreciative of that. Also, you develop a very good understanding if you're documenting something. It says now you are learning by teaching, just like how you do. And then also, the person will do, usually when you kind of give that generosity to a project, you will get it back in the form of a really good code review. The maintainer will read your documentation and let you know, hey, this corner edge case, this is not true, or you may have a little misunderstanding here or there. And then, they will really, that's a good way to also build trust and also communicate that you have a lot of context into what is happening. And so that's one thing. Another thing that I did, and this was unique to me, was I did a lot of the GitHub Actions and CI because at the time I was working at GitHub and they just came out with GitHub Actions, and I really wanted to learn it for whatever reason. But it's a very painful thing to use. Like I would say I hate it, but I wanted to just check it out and learn it, and because I felt like this is something I want to know. So I did it for all the fast AI projects I could. I spent a lot of time on that. And similarly, I think, that was really well, appreciated about, setting up tests, kind of doing sort of this type of work. And then after building a lot of this context, then I think, these kind of activities or other kind of activities like that, you can build a lot of trust. And then when you build this trust, then you can think about creating projects or, contributing, to code, because then you have a relationship, and then people have an understanding. They know that you understand the context, um, and you can have a back and forth conversation. So that's kind of some advice. That's how I'll go about it.
Excellent. Okay, well, thank you so much, Shamal, and thank you if you've managed to listen this far. Hopefully, that's given you all sorts of inspiring avenues to explore. There's lots of outcomes from this talk. I think you've got to go start a blog, you've got to go check out MBDev, and now maybe start thinking about if there's somewhere you'd like to contribute. So yeah, Hamel, it's been a real pleasure.
Yeah, and also take a Jono's course,
Yeah, take the course.
and really like read about Jono, and I would follow this guy if I were you. So follow him on Twitter, follow him wherever he is, and just watch out for what this guy does next.
Okay, we'll see if my pride can bear leaving that in, or if I edit early. But otherwise, we'll see you in the next episode.
All right, sounds good.
All right, cool. And recording is stopped. If I can find my button.